So Don, if you could take us through your presentation.
Alrighty. So good evening, everyone. So I'm a professional engineer, worked in flood stuff for the last 40 odd years. And I was asked by the recovery team to assist with assessing the damages throughout the Kootenay Boundary Regional District and also within the city of Grand Forks, and specifically looking at making recommendations for recovery for dwellings and businesses, and the most important ones were those which were homes that were either destroyed or likely should not be restored in the location they're in because the risk is too high. So what I intend to do tonight is just at a city level walk you through what I've looked at and the various neighborhoods and the recommendations that were discussed with each of the communities, neighborhoods over the past 2 days, and then move on to letting you ask questions. So next slide, please. So this is basically the way that the flooding came in May. It came in through Johnson Flats, through a breach in the berm here. It overtopped the banks and came in this way. It came into and out of South Ruckle, came across the river and into the Oxbow area, back out of the Oxbow, around through City Park, and into downtown, as well as into North Ruckle. And then we had the Granby coming down and also coming over the banks in some locations on the west side, as well as affecting properties on the east side, upstream of the highway, and then all along the river downstream of the highway. And we also had impacts at the Rockville plant. The biggest area of concern is the confluence of the Granby and the Kettle, because what we had this year, as you're probably all aware, was a synchronization of the peak flows coming out of both of the rivers. And what happened in the confluence area is what's called a backwater effect. This water is trying to get by, this water is trying to get by, and there's too much water, and so what it does is the water level rises even further back up both the river systems as it is trying to exit further down the system. Next, please. So, as you know, the areas flooded are these, and these were the areas that I looked at within the city. Next. So, number one concern is public safety, and the other concern is coming up with permanent solutions. And as you know, when the Premier was through and met with the community, he made it very clear that what the government wants is a permanent solution. They did not tell us what that solution is, but they asked that we, in our considerations, that we consider things that will put you in a position where you're not going to be affected again as you have been over the last year or two. Next. So the priorities, as has been touched on already, is one of my priorities was assisting the recovery team with regards to safe, warm, and dry options for people that were displaced, and that was immediate concern. And those of you that were affected in that way, you know that there has been ongoing since the flood with regards to the recovery team. The other item that is really important is preparing for 2019, and we'll be talking about that in more detail later, but that is of immediate concern. And then in the medium term, it is assisting the recovery team to determine which dwellings should be repaired and what properties should be considered as not residential because the flood risk is too high. And what are the solutions, and finding permanent solutions. And the reality is, as Steve indicated, with the various funding streams that are available from both the provincial government and the federal government and elsewhere, these permanent solutions, by the time we get through the engineering and the funding and the design and to the construction stage, is going to be in somewhere in this framework of 2 to 4 years. Next. So the options that are being considered by council, and again, I reiterate that no decision has been made, and the purpose is, again, of this meeting is to hear from you as a community. The first option and these are can apply to all of the areas within the city where they're affected, is the opportunity to relocate the most at-risk residents. By relocating out of the floodplain, out of the area where there is the flood risk, we end up with a permanent solution that has the lowest risk of flooding again. However, these approaches are both complex from a funding perspective and implementation, and we had plenty of discussion over the past 2 days with regards to what everyone's concerns are, and they're very, very legitimate concerns, and in many cases we don't have the specific answers that people are looking for at this point in time, simply because the request for the type of funding to implement these solutions has not gone forward, because council is waiting for the input from the community and in which to make that decision. Relocating people is obviously disruptive to a community because it changes the fabric and nature of the community, whether it's some or all, and it's also upsetting to residents. A community is a community for a whole lot of reasons, and uprooting people can be very stressful. Next. The second option, and this applies to some of the areas, is to construct new dikes and rebuild dwellings at or above the flood level. And that applies to those dwellings that should be allowed to be restored. The flood level, the flood construction level, is a level that is set out in your city bylaw with regards to floodplain development, and it is based on the 1 in 200 year flood event, and it depends upon where you are in the city as to what that elevation might be. And it is based, you take the 1 in 200 year estimated flood and what the elevation of that water might be in a specific area, and then the flood construction level is actually 0.6 of a meter above that level. If you build dikes and people rebuild behind the dikes, there is always going to be some ongoing risk, simply from the fact that, as I indicated, these structures are designed around a 1 in 200 year event, and this is both a national and a provincial guidance that is given on that level. And there's nothing to say that you're not going to get an event that might exceed that level, and you may be wondering what happened in 2018, and you've probably heard numbers that range from anywhere from 1 in 300 years to 1 in 1,000 years. And the reality is that the analysis has not been completed yet, and we don't know what those flood levels actually were, the return periods for those floods on either the Kettle or the Granby. However, we do know that they were very significant floods. So with regards to building to a flood construction level, that will provide safety as long as the floods don't exceed what is the level that is used. And again, this is disruptive, and it is also upsetting if you are told that your house needs to be raised by several feet in order to meet the new requirements. So these were basically the two options. Next, please. So we looked at the Johnson Flats area, and the idea for this level, this area here, which is rural, and a lot of it is in the ALR, was to, there are a number of houses in here that did not get flooded, and in most cases those houses that didn't get flooded were houses that were built since the city's floodplain bylaw came into effect, and they were built to that level and they didn't flood. There were some houses that got some flooding around them, but it was in probably a foot of water or 30 centimeters of water or so, less than half a meter. And then there were quite a number of houses on this side that actually got more than half a meter, in some cases well over a meter of water around them. However, the idea, one of the concepts we looked at was to build a dike system in here to protect the neighborhood, and the cost to build that dike around this neighborhood is probably in the $10 to $15 million range. And so we looked at other options, and the reality is when you look at the fact that most of these houses out here can likely be raised to meet the flood construction level, and it will provide a safe neighborhood. And if they are raised, and in addition, if 12th Street is raised so that emergency vehicles, this down to 59th, from what I could see, it didn't flood, but up here on 12th, it did, which made it, in some cases, impossible for people to exit and for emergency vehicles to get in there. So by raising the street and by raising the houses, floodwaters can still move across here if they overtop the banks and flood across the plain, but they flood around people's houses, and it reduces the pressure on the whole river system through here. These two red polygons here indicate where there was overbank flow that came through up in this area, and some overbank flow in all this brown color in here, gray color, is sand that was brought in when the water flowed through here. And what we're looking at is there an approach that we can use that will prevent further erosion of these banks and stabilize these banks in this area, and so that water will still overtop but will not flow through as a river. So that's what we're looking at and discussed with the residents in the Johnson Flats area. The other option that was discussed was the option that there is a very clear floodplain line on your maps that the city has produced for what is the floodplain, and so an alternative would be to move residences off the floodplain. In other words, it would be returned to fully agricultural land, and other arrangements would be made for options for residential living. If we move into the South Ruckle area, the floodwater came around and came over the bank and through this way, and this whole area down in here The reason that it's not built is because it is fairly low, and it is where water pooled up against this is an old oxbow through here that gets cut off by the railway, but the railway runs all the way around the rim of that, and so water flowed in, around, and some people in here were in like 2 meters of water. However, some of the houses down here along the street near the river had very limited water, and there were houses down in here, again, some that were built in accordance with the floodplain bylaw that weren't flooded. But the majority of the houses in this neighborhood were flooded to some degree. The options that we discussed with that community was the option of constructing a permanent dike along here, along with what's referred to as internal drainage works, which is a drainage system that allows treatment for water that accumulates in behind the dike, because as you all know, water comes up through the ground when the river levels are high. The neighborhood indicated that they would also like to have the opportunity to discuss the opportunity of relocating, and so that is clearly an option that was put forward to council, which would be that this neighborhood would be relocated, and the land would go back into some other use but not residential. As we move up into North Ruckle, again, in this neighborhood, all but one house, and actually tonight I heard there was one more. There were 2 houses in that neighborhood that didn't flood. All the rest of them did. And so, and they are at the highest risk of just about anybody in the community because of the residential area, because of the backwater effect that comes from the confluence with the 2 rivers. So the options discussed with that neighborhood was, number 1, to relocate the neighborhood, and the other option, which is the dotted line, was an idea of, okay, we could construct a dike, and then the homes would be, as they're being restored, would be raised to meet the flood construction level. And again, the general consensus that was given to council was many of them favored the opportunity of relocating. They did not want to go through this again. The area of downtown, there is, what has to be done is downtown needs to be protected. And the red line indicates a dike that ties into the height of land in behind the park and swimming pool, the RV park down here, and then it comes down closer to the river, and then it goes up Riverside Drive, and it would be permanent works, and in Riverside Drive, and in the RV park, for example, it would be using the street, raising the street up, so that the street became at the height that would be the protective works. There is also a need for internal drainage in that system as well, because there's backwater effects through the storm systems and an elevated water table in the lower part of the city that is a concern. The other areas of concern include the east side of the highway in here where it went over the banks and flooded this neighborhood up in here. And then where across the bridge, where we've got the motels and the trailer park down in here, it's all below, well below a flood construction level, and these areas need to be considered. The options there are either raise the land back to the highway, from the riverbank back to the highway, and armor it so that the bank can't erode, and raise the ground so that the the motels and the trailer park and any residential space used there would be able to meet the floodplain bylaw. This gets complicated because there are setbacks from the river within the city's bylaws that would have to be considered by council and how they want to address that. But that area is being considered as well. And this polygon down in here is the section in front of the Rockville plant where there is some works in there, but the works are not high enough and they're not continuous, and we need permanent works in this area to protect your your waste treatment plant and also the Rockville plant as well. Next. See, that's it. Okay, so Mr. MC.